Today's webinar is the second of a four-part series on digital preservation entitled Digital Preservation Fundamentals, Text and Image Formats, and it's presented by Jacob Nadal. Jacob was appointed as the Preservation Officer for the UCLA Library in 2008. Previously, he served as the Field Service Librarian and Acting Head of Collections Care at the New York Public Library, and is head of the Craig Preservation Laboratory at Indiana University. I'm now happy to introduce Jacob Nadal.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I'm excited to see so many people here and hope you find this webinar useful. In the first installment, we did a sort of general survey of preservation and talked about how things are preserved, how to think about preservation in a sort of process-minded way that lets you kind of get on with the work of building digital libraries while also being sort of safe and sound and doing good risk management. Today we're going to drill a little deeper into text and image file formats, which for many of us are, if not the entirety of what we have in our digital libraries, are certainly one of the most important formats. We're going to talk about some of the specific technical issues that exist with text and image file formats and talk about the things we need to be aware of in preserving them for the long term. I'll also remind you that the first webinar in this series was archived on the InfoPeople website if you wish to review that one, and this one will be as well. So let's talk about text. Digital text encodings have their roots way back in telegraph codes. So the ASCII, the text format that you've heard of, the American Standard Code for Information Interchange, dates from 1968. So these are not new on the scene. Many of these things have 40 or 50 years of history behind them, already a good indication that they're preservable. ASCII is a 7-bit code, so that means there are 7 magnetic bits assigned to each character in an ASCII text string on your computer, 7 yes or no's. The ASCII format itself has 32 control characters, things that give instructions to the computer, and 94 principal characters. And there they are. That's the US ASCII code chart. So this would tell a computer as it read the magnetic stripe or the pits on an optical disc. If it knew it was reading ASCII text, this would tell the computer how to decode it. So if you wanted to know how to, as it were, write a capital letter J in ASCII, you would program your computer to write 1010100, and that gives you a letter J, on and on and on. This covers obviously the basics of what you would need to communicate, as long as the only language you wanted to use was English, and you didn't want to get too elaborate with any glyphs or characterization. That falls short of what most libraries and archives need to do, obviously. And so the common format for libraries and archives that are doing digitization projects is Unicode, and that's stored in a format called UTF-8. UTF-8 and ASCII are equivalent in the sense that they're both ways of encoding textual data. UTF stands for Unicode Transmission Format, 8-bit. So just as ASCII was a 7-bit format, UTF-8 is an 8-bit format. It has an additional bit. And in fact, it can have a number of octets. So it can have up to 4 of those 8-bit bytes that make up a single character in Unicode. The first 128 of those are the ASCII chart we just saw. So ASCII is tremendously forward compatible. So ASCII is a very safe and simple text format, but it doesn't have a lot of range. UTF-8 expands on that by adding characters for a variety of different scripts, mathematical notation, music notation. There's a vast range of material that can be represented in Unicode and UTF-8. It also has the advantage in digital preservation of being easy to identify. If you were part of the last webinar, we took some time to talk about decipherment and decryption, and we used the example of Linear B, an ancient language. And one of the things that helped that decipherment was being able to, for instance, identify the counting system so that people knew what numbers looked like. Likewise, UTF-8 has the virtue of being easy to identify. So there are simple search patterns that one can do that will, better than 99% of the time, identify UTF-8 text strings. So they're very easily characterized, which means that if there's ever a sort of catastrophe and you need to recover data from a corrupted database or a set of text files, UTF-8 gives you a leg up on doing that recovery. One of the reasons it's valued as a preservation format. Also, the second bullet point here is that it's the default native encoding for XML, and increasingly XML is the way we store, share, and transmit data to one another. The HTML language that is used on websites all across the web is a flavor of XML, if you will, and XML is by and large the way we have one database export data so that it can be moved into a new database. So when we think about migrating digital data, very often XML is the sort of intermediary format. So we go from, say, one digital library system to a future version of it, or for instance, you ever in your archive decide to move from your current digital library infrastructure to a new infrastructure. Very often you'll pass through XML on the way. So this is very important for preservation purposes, is using the format that works best with XML. And then finally, UTF-8 provides support for multiple languages. So for almost all of us, the materials we have in our collections have different languages and different scripts, and there's simply no way to effectively and accurately represent those in the ASCII text format. This, just to give you a little sense, are some snapshots from different parts of the UTF-8 character set specification. So you can see codes here for Armenian capital letters, Bengali, Thai. There are dozens and dozens of languages that now have UTF-8 representations, as well as there are UTF-8 encodings for technical symbols. Mathematical operators are a good example of that. So UTF-8 as a character set provides a lot of room, and unless you're doing some very exotic digitization, probably UTF-8 already has all of the characters you need. And so this is really where the digital library world is at in terms of representing textual data. Those Unicode character sets that you just saw were, of course, an image. And this is an important piece to remember and an important point in our transition here. Computers don't read. They encode and decode. So if you ask your computer to find the word preservation in a PDF file, it is really just looking for matching strings, so a text string, and that text string, in fact, is resolved to a series of ones and zeros. So when we talk about text in the digital library world, we're really talking about that encoded text. When we think about something like a digitized book, we're talking about a page image, something that captures the visual presentation of that text, as well as the text transcription and the metadata that holds all of that together. And so this is an important distinction to make. As many of you who have been involved in scanning projects know, step one, and in some ways the easiest step, is capturing an image of the page. The more complex work, the thing that creates a truly robust digital archive, is transcribing that image so that there is live, searchable, encoded text behind it. That's done through optical character recognition programs. It's done by simply transcribing and typing text again. And the marriage of those two is really what creates a robust digital object. I want to pause right now because we're going to spend the next part, and really the majority of this, talking about how we create digital images. I'm hoping people are basically familiar with these text concepts, so I want to take a minute or two to see if there are questions that you want to address before we go on. We'll also, of course, have time at the end of the webinar to take questions about the entire presentation. Okay, good. So let's move on then and talk about what makes a good digital image. This is the format you've probably heard about most, and we'll continue to hear about in digital library circles. The TIFF format, it stands for Tagged Image File Format, was developed by a company called Aldus in 1986. So again, even though this is relatively new, the TIFF image format has been around better than 25 years now. It's in version 6. That version was published in 1992 and has no IP restrictions on it. There's a sort of legalistic point to be made here that Adobe Inc. owns the TIFF file format, but they don't charge any licensing fees and they don't restrict usage of it. So it's an open published specification. I want to note here that although we shorthand in library and archival circles TIFF as our uncompressed, reliable, open archival format, the TIFF specification is actually fairly broad and includes lots of allowances for compressed image data. And it's important to be diligent, especially for outsourcing or contracting imaging work, to be diligent about using uncompressed TIFF. There's also a part of the TIFF standard that allows for LZW. This is Linfeld Zempf Welch, the guys who developed it. It's a kind of lossless compression, and it's debatable how safe that is for digital preservation. Of course, in preservation, we don't like to have any compression in file formats because there's a concern that as we move forward in time and if we lose track of the information about how that compression was done at one point in the time, being able to uncompress that data later may be really problematic. Whenever there's compression, there's some sort of data alteration, if not data loss, and recovering from that in the future adds complexity to the digital preservation challenge. So uncompressed TIFF is really the kind of plain vanilla standard archival format for imaging. The other format you may be hearing things about and maybe thinking about using in projects is JPEG 2000. It was developed in 2000 by the Joint Photographers Expert Group, released as an ISO standard, and again with a no-cost license for its core component, similar to the way that Adobe owns the TIFF specification but has released it for use. JPEG is owned and maintained by JPEG, but is released as a no-cost file format for broad use. JPEG 2000 is what's called a wavelet-based file format, and so it can hold several levels of compression within one file. And you can think of this almost as a sort of pyramid of data. So there's an uncompressed layer that tells you all of the information in the JPEG, and then on top of that are different levels of compression and different levels of zoning. And the reason this matters and the reason it's interesting to people in computer sciences is that essentially from one file format you can serve the content in various ways. So if you're asking for a thumbnail, the web server can deliver just that layer of the JPEG file to a user. If that user then asks for a high-resolution web version, a larger set of data can be delivered. And if then someone with appropriate permissions asks for the archival kind of a full-fledged version, that data can be delivered all from the same file. And so potentially that lets you build a very elegant delivery and storage system for the file. The problem is there's a shortage of authoring tools for JPEG 2000. So it's a file format that looks excellent for all of our purposes on paper, but in practice can be very difficult to work with. Image editing programs don't necessarily support the whole file format. There aren't necessarily the tools you would want to actually deliver on all of the potential the features that JPEG 2000 has. And also because it's new, it's relatively common for one JPEG 2000 editing tool to damage the file created by another one. That is, they don't all implement the file format in consistent, reliable ways. I think there's great potential for JPEG 2000, and over the next couple of years, hopefully we have a more robust support for it. So hopefully if you tune into this webinar again in 5 years, I'll be telling you, oh, JPEG 2000 is really the way to go. There are great authoring tools for it, and it simplifies so much of the work you want to do in your archives. We're not there quite yet, and at the present time, the recommendation still is to use TIFF images. There really are sort of old standbys. I also want to mention digital negative. There's been a lot of discussion about this as digital cameras have become more robust and more common. Digital negative is a file format that was developed by Adobe to provide a non-proprietary way to manage what's called raw camera data. And raw data is essentially a readout of everything that the image sensor in a camera saw. Photographers love this because it lets them take that batch of data and essentially virtually reshoot on their computer. So if they decide that they had a few aperture settings they wish to change, they can change those and modify the output of the digital negative. This is also in some ways looks good for preservation purposes because it's a little bit more closer to what the camera saw in the first place. The problem that exists is that each camera manufacturer creates and manages raw data in slightly different ways. So the way that Canon may output raw data from its sensors to the computer and the way that Nikon might do this are different. Some of you may have heard actually recently Olympus has gotten into some financial and legal straits. So it begs the question of if Olympus goes under, will we be able to understand their raw data at all? And will the tools that they make to support that raw data still be available to us? So digital negative as a preservation format creates some problems simply because there are so many manufacturers' fingers in the pies. And it's actually good to get one step away from that and store data in something like a TIFF format that's not tied to any particular manufacturer. That said, for those of you who are thinking about born digital photography, digital negative may really be the thing to collect. Adobe's kept the format non-proprietary, and it is a little closer to raw camera data than you would get in a TIFF image or a JPEG image. So it may have a place, but I would argue against it for most scanning and imaging projects where you're converting from an analog object to an image file. In that case, I think TIFF remains the most reliable file format. Some other formats, the other JPEG format, not JPEG 2000, RAW, which we talked about, portable network graphics, that's a file format that's often used to deliver image data on the web, and Photoshop documents, PSD files, are also things that we see coming into our archives and occasionally discussed as components in digital library and archive systems. They all have some sort of problem. In the case of JPEG and PNG, the portable network graphic, the compression or size limits become a problem. That is, they can't hold the full range of data that we'd like in an archival master. In other cases, the Photoshop document format in RAW, intellectual property restrictions or manufacturers' proprietary standards can become a problem, so that we may not be able to successfully decode that data in the future. And then the other format where you probably encounter images a lot that's worth talking about is PDF. So there are lots of PDF types, and these each have sort of varying levels of preservability to them. PDF is currently at version 1.7, and simplistically, a simple way to think about PDF is as a metadata wrapper for text and graphic content. So a PDF file can contain almost any media. can have audio or video. It can obviously have text. It can have forms that you input data into. And it can store both raster and vector graphics. Raster graphics are the type of image files we're probably most used to thinking about in our line of work. Essentially just a grid of colored dots, a grid of pixels that presents an image. Vector graphics are a mathematical description of curves and fills that are used to essentially paint electronically. The virtue of those is that they can be resized and rescaled without losing fidelity. And if you work with architectural materials or digital illustrations, vector graphics are common in those fields. So for people who are doing illustration or animation digitally, work in vector graphic environments. PDF version 1.4 has an offshoot called PDF/A for archival that is used for archiving. And so this is a subset of the PDF specification that is more restrictive about the types of content that can be included and the types of data structures that can be in the PDF. PDF-A is, in fact, very preservable, and it's been nice to see it widely adopted. Current versions of Office, for instance, allow you to print directly to a PDF-A file. Microsoft manages to make that PDF-A file as complex as they possibly could have, but PDF does have a role in preservation, and I certainly don't discourage its use, but do be aware that PDF versions are not all of the same, and the way that one tool creates a PDF and another tool creates a PDF can lead to some pretty substantially different output. But there is a space in there, and what you're looking for in terms of a very preservable PDF is this PDF version 1.4 PDF-A format. Having talked about the sort of basic types and formats used for images, I think it's good to talk about what actually goes into that image itself. And we talk about images, and in future webinars we'll talk about audio data and video data as well in terms of resolution and bit depth. And resolution is essentially a measure of how frequently the scanning or digitization equipment samples the source material. In the case of imaging, that means how many samples per physical inch. In the case of a sound recording, it's the number of samples per second of time that elapses. For digital images, 300 dpi is sort of our bare minimum recommendation for creating an archival master. 600 dpi has become fairly standard, and in some special circumstances, people are doing imaging at an even higher level, 1200 pixels per inch or more. These numbers emerge from some studies about the way the human eye resolves images. And 300 pixels per inch is about the level at which the human eye can't distinguish individual pixels. Your mileage may vary. I probably can't distinguish more than 200 dpi myself. If you're a real eagle eye, you might do better than I will. Also, the distance at which you're viewing something makes a difference. 600 dpi is a standard that has emerged sort of out of best practice that allows essentially some overhead to ensure that there is plenty of data there to work with before legibility becomes a problem. The other aspect of this is color. So if you've got 300 dots in each inch, you have to then color each one of those dots to make an image. And this is done in computers by encoding red, green, and blue values. This is the RGB color you hear about. And an 8-bit, right, which if you harken back to what we were talking about with text files, again, this is just 8 zeros and ones, allows you to represent 256 shades. So in a 24-bit image, you have 3 8-bit channels, 8 bits for red, 8 bits for green, and 8 bits for blue. Each one of those provides 256 options for each color, and 3 times 256 gives you about 16 million color combinations, which is a lot. It's enough to cover the majority of imaging we need to do. Getting this data is limited in scanners by the number of sensors in the scanner's array. So it has a little bar array that moves across the scan bed. It has sensors top to bottom, and then it has a motor that moves it left to right. And the fineness of the array and the control of the motor gives you the eventual resolution. And when you're looking at scanner specs, it's important to look for that actual hardware resolution rather than pixels that can be added or interpolated in software. In cameras, resolution is limited by the physical size, the actual height and width of the sensor in the camera, and then the density of sensors on that imaging chip. So when you look at cameras, you'll see a megapixel resolution, which is really just telling you how many millions of pixels are available on that sensor chip. All that said, there's still more to be known about digital color. And so although our kind of common recommendation has been 600 dpi, 24-bit color stored in a TIFF file, for that color to be really useful, it needs to be calibrated. The eye, the image sensor, and the image rendering device, the monitor, the projector, or what have you, all have different color sensitivity. And none of these are going to be a perfect match for the source, for the actual object that you're looking at. And those sources will actually vary in their color output depending on the kind of light you shine on them. So the best practice that's emerged is to calibrate every device in the imaging chain and then not edit color on the initial capture. And something that I really discourage is if you're in your imaging shop, imaging something and then looking on your monitor and making color corrections. Every good study that's been done shows that you only add noise to the channel. That is, color does not actually become any more faithful to the original capture. In fact, the less intervention you do and the more systematic calibration you perform, the better your color output will be. Having created that calibrated master, then one can create derivatives for each use case. So when you create a web derivative, you then may really want to see how it renders in a browser and on various monitors. If you're going to send something to the printer, you'll actually be able to print it on paper and see if the colors come out the way you need. But that source file should again be left alone. To give you a sense of this, I want to take a few minutes and talk about chromatic adaptation. And this is essentially the don't trust your eyes lesson. I'm going to show you a picture in a moment of a fruit basket, and you'll see pretty obviously that part of it's been tinted. And then I'm going to show you a simple color image. And we're going to look at that for 20 or 30 seconds and without looking away. Then I'll show you the original image again, and I think you'll get a sense of why the imaging community is so sensitive about this question of not trusting your eyes. So there's an image. Just look in the center of this image. There's a little black dot there. Then I'm going to put up a new color, and we'll look at that for 20 or 30 seconds. And just keep your eyes fixed in the center of this image on the black dot. And in a moment, we're going to go back to that first image we saw. Of course, what's happening right now as you look at this is that your eyes are beginning to adjust. They're calibrating themselves to see the world as sort of blue on one side and yellow on the other. And in just a few moments, when I show you that first image again, hopefully, again, we're translating over the web, hopefully you'll see a profound difference. So hopefully as that happens, you see the colors shift on that image. You can imagine if you spend a lot of time in a room with lots of different color and light sources. Okay, good, I got a wow in the chat. Your eyes begin to adjust, right? So your eyes have an idea of what the world should look like, and when the world disagrees with it, they begin to correct. and this leads to lots of problems in digital imaging. The eye processes light in two ways. One is hue and saturation, so the cones in your eyes perceive color, shade, and depth, so light blue to very dark blue, for instance. And then the other way your eyes process color is with the rods, which perceive luminance, that is, how bright or how dim an image is. Computers and digital imaging devices don't see light that way. They break light into three color channels, red, green, and blue, assign a fixed amount of data to each one of those colors, right, and then store that as digital data, ones and zeros. Colors are then returned as RGB in digital devices or in CMYK, black, blue, magenta, yellow, and black for print output. So already the way your eye understands light and the way computers do are slightly different. There are ways to overcome this. Our visible spectrum ranges from 390 to 750 nanometers. Below that is infrared or heat, and above that is ultraviolet. Under different types of radiation, media refract and fluoresce in different ways. So if we shine X-rays at something or infrared light at something, we get back different parts of the spectra. And those techniques are used, for instance, have you seen these studies where we'll look at, say, the underpainting of a drawing or the underdrawing behind a painting. By shining different types of light and different spectra at it, we can bring forward different image elements. That technology is by and large not built into our scanners and digital cameras. Mostly we just use the visible spectrum. But be aware that any object you're looking at is showing you more spectral data than your eye can capture, and in some ways than your sensors can capture. Just to give you a sense of what this all means, here's the classic visible spectrum from red on one end to violet on the other. And depending on your color sensitivity, you'll perceive the edges of this chart as more or less black. To give you another sense of how color can be captured, this is output from video capture. So a video image is stored as essentially a black and white or grayscale image that's very high resolution, and then two color and luminance channels that are much lower resolution that are layered on top of it to produce a final image. So again, yet another way of sampling color data. This is what's called the CIELAB reference model, and so this is a way of describing what the eye sees, and that vertical column is the luminance channel that we talked about, and then the sort of the colored arrows are the color bands. So CIELAB is a way that imaging scientists will talk to each other about what an actual color is. So a CIELAB value has a luminance, a brightness from top to bottom, and then it has a place on the AB scale for the color value. And then a CIELAB value can be mapped onto a particular RGB value. Here, for instance, are the 16.7 million RGB colors. To give you a sense of what that shows you, the large sort of half teardrop shape are the colors that can be described in CIELAB. The yellow quadrangle is what RGB computer devices display, and the blue pentangle is the print gamut, the colors that can be printed using the CMYK color space. As you can see, there's a limited zone where all three of those things overlap. What happens in calibration and what happens in a good imaging workflow is that you maximize the overlap of those three spaces so you can get the most accurate possible color calibration. Oh, I'm going to send a note. CIE Lab is the name of that imaging model for color. What happens when you calibrate devices is that essentially each device looks at known color values and reports back what it sees. and that's used to create a crosswalk, essentially a map of how each device perceives light, and that lets you get accurate color. That data is stored in what's called an ICC profile, and that should be included in imaging workflows so that when you move an image from one system to another, the color values can go with it. One final little thing I want to do is show you this. So in the last several slides, I hope no one has noticed the background color changing too much. It actually started white just after our little chromatic adaptation and ended in this sort of pale eggshell color. Again, I do this just to remind you of how much your eye can adjust and how quickly. To give you a sense, those are all of the slides we looked at, from the starting color to the ending color. Color is actually in some ways the most finicky part of imaging workflows, and dissertations can and have been written about how to get the best digital color. What I would say to you is to be aware as you get into imaging projects that you need to have a plan for color capture. And the safest plan is fortunately the simplest, and that's to have a calibration system and use it consistently. If you're doing this in-house, there are simple color calibration kits you can purchase, and though you can spend probably as much money as you want to, spending anything gets you a lot further ahead than trying to do this by eye. If you're outsourcing projects and outsourcing digital image capture, then it's just something you want to talk to your vendors about and find out how they plan to calibrate. And be aware that there's still a little bit of mythology and snake oil about color capture. It's a good area to press your vendors to understand how their imaging workflows work. Finally, with Born Digital collections, one thing you want to think about when collections are coming in is how color is represented, right? So if you're getting image files that were created on a computer, born digitally, and are in the RGB color space, that's great. They're going to live in their native environment. If you're scanning from printed files, CMYK files, there may be some sort of edge cases where you can't accurately represent color, and that should be part of your thinking in planning digital projects. So, with that, my slides are open. I see I've got a couple questions I want to touch on, and feel free to be again in the Q&A area, typing in more questions, and we've got looks like 15-20 minutes here that we can talk about image and text formats. Let's see, I've got a note here from Mark. Yeah, so this is, I probably was unclear in speaking about the DNG format. So DNG is a way of kind of harmonizing raw camera data. So every camera manufacturer has a proprietary way of managing their sensor data. And what happens with a DNG file is that raw sensor data gets mapped onto a standard way of storing that camera data. So the only risk there is really in that transition from raw data to the digital negative, and that's fairly non-destructive. The cautionary note I would say there is that when you're using DNG for photographic data, it's an excellent file format. There's not a lot of reason that I'm aware of that you would want to use DNG for capturing, say, page images or other kind of reformatted material. So I think it's a really robust format for born digital photography. I don't know that it buys you a lot in instances where you're doing other reformatting. Thank you. Yeah, Mark's got exactly the right analogy as a PDF for raw data. A question here, are all pixels created equal and are all sensors the same size? So here's a conceptual versus technological issue. So a pixel is just a picture element. It's a sort of abstract unit of imaging. A sensor is an actual device that's going to measure electrical current. So a sensor can be large or small, sensitive or insensitive, and the number of sensors on the number of essentially pixels that a sensor array can capture has to do with the actual electronics, and the number of pixels in an image is an abstract measurement. So different manufacturers have sensors of varying quality and density, and it's worth saying too that the way that signals are captured electronically in a photosensor have as much to do with the lens that's pointing light at them and the construction of the camera body as they do with any sort of abstract model of imaging. So in general, a pixel is a pixel is a pixel, but be aware that when you get down to the details of each individual camera, the actual physical size of its sensor array and the sensors on it will have some impact on the quality of imaging it can do. Let's see. Let me pick up on type of scanner while we're talking about this, and the question about long end of images at a certain DPI. So the long end of an image, when you hear this sort of referenced, some scanners, especially slide scanners, have essentially a fixed sensor array that takes a photograph of the slide. And so if you think about a 35 millimeter slide, it's already greatly reduced from the object that the photo was taken of. And so the scanning of those slides is really just to take a sample of that frame, right, which may be, say, 6,000 pixels on the long edge. So the actual resolution of that image is 6,000 pixels per 35 millimeters, and from that you create an image. When you're seeing that, oftentimes you'll see that in slide scanning. You'll see it in museum imaging, where, for instance, if you're going to take a picture of a painting, 600 dpi would be an enormous file size. So if the painting is 4 feet on its long side, your imaging standard might be to do something like 6,000 pixels along the long edge, right, which would have to do with the size of your camera's sensor array in pixels and the size of the image you were working with. So there's certainly a point at which, when you're talking about photographing architecture, sculpture, paintings, or you're reformatting slides, where 600 dpi falls away. For scanning text and photographic prints, 600 dpi is sort of an archival and library standard. The museum community works a little bit differently than we do in those senses. In terms of purchasing a type of scanner, honestly, the quality of scanners has moved ahead quite a ways in the last decade. The question you really want to ask is, what is the hardware resolution of the scanner, and what type of image output? So if your scanner can output an uncompressed TIFF image and it has good hardware resolution, that is, if the imaging sensor is actually capable of doing 600 dpi, you've probably got a decent scanner. What you'll often see advertised is something like 4,800 dpi, and the way that's done is by using a smaller sensor, taking samples of the image, and then using software to add pixels in between them to interpolate. And if you look at the specifications or manuals that are available for most scanners, there at some point you'll be able to find in there the actual hardware resolution. Yeah, so a question about, let's see, I just want to see if there are any other equipment questions while we're talking about that. Oh, so calibration kits, there are a variety of manufacturers for these. Some things to look at, I'll put them into the chat here. I1, Greytag, Macbeth are kind of common manufacturers for these. And what they consist of is a color target that's imaged by each device, scanner, camera, what have you, and then a sort of photometer, something that can be used to read back output. So usually this is a little sort of suction cup gizmo that goes on the monitor or projector. And so what you would do is to scan this target, and then the target is displayed on a second device, and the output is read by this photometer that then determines how much drift has occurred. Or so, for instance, you would to profile a printer, you would scan the target, print the target, and then use the photometer to read the printed output. That's all fed into the calibration software, and it creates a profile for each device. Prices range from $100 up to several thousands of dollars. And again, this is the sort of thing where simply buying into the system gives you the lion's share of the benefits. And at the point you're thinking about spending more and more, you have to also have be at the point where you have a professional photographic staff who's making those decisions for you. The use cases for the more expensive and more detailed equipment are more and more require more and more expertise. So if you're trying to simply get good, reliable color, getting a calibration system gives you the majority of those benefits. If you're trying to do color accurate enough that you can distinguish different pigment types, hopefully you also have a conservator and a photo technician who are helping you steer through those decisions. So I would encourage you not to get sort of lost in the woods there. Let's see, are people hearing me? I have a few notes that audio is dropping out. Let me touch on, on a couple questions here about image derivatives and selection of color, 24 versus 32-bit, for instance. So for derivative use cases, very often when we think about an archival imaging flow, we create this sort of high-resolution master file with well-calibrated color. And then from that, we create derivative files. So a common derivative is for the web. And so for a web derivatives, you may have a very small sort of thumbnail-sized file for browsing and indexing. And then you may have a high-resolution version that's still not the full uncompressed master file, but that has as much or more data than anyone can comfortably see on a standard monitor. So it may be, say, 1,600 or 2,000 pixels along the long edge, right? So that when someone looks at that full screen on their computer, they see a really rich image. So those would be common web derivatives that might be compressed. So you might use JPEG or PNG as a compression. And they might also be, in some cases, color calibrated. Probably not a concern for your thumbnail, but for that high resolution version, you might use that color calibration file to create the derivative. That data gets sent to the computer. If someone has a computer that is set up to do color calibration, they'll get a better image experience than someone who doesn't. You'll still have no control over their setup, but you at least allow that possibility. You might then also at some point wish to print an image. So you might take your master image file. It might appear as a printed version in your annual report. If you're especially in a museum, you might publish an exhibition catalog. And so from that master file, you would create a CMYK derivative that would be used to print. And again, because CMYK and RGB don't quite agree, you might make some decisions. You know, you might work with your printer to recalibrate colors slightly to get something that looks good to the eye between the original and the printed version. Those would be sort of the most common versions. And in every case, having the sort of master file to go back to enables you to create derivatives. The mistake that was made early in digital library projects was essentially to try to create a version that looks good to the eye, which often meant a version that looked good in print. And then when you tried to go back and do alternate digital versions, you had lost or altered color data. A story that I can tell on myself was from preparing a Christmas card that a library sent out. And in doing the transition to CMYK, there was a blue and a purple that became almost indistinguishable. This Christmas card went out to sort of everyone who had used this special collection, and we got a response back from this scholar, delighted and thrilled to see this image that he'd never seen, and amazed that we had this shade of blue in an object from this date and time, because it suggested all of the, and he was beginning to, I think, write his next book about trade routes. What really had happened was that something that should have been purple came out blue, and to him that said a pigment that should not have been available in one part of the world was. To us, it just meant that we sort of had goofed something up in the imaging workflow. Let me also touch on this question of 32-bit versus 24-bit color. 32-bit gives greater accuracy for sure, and the only reason there is any skepticism in the kind of digital preservation or digital archive community has to do with the software that color is going to pass through. So if at a certain point that 32-bit image has to pass through a 24-bit piece of software that only understands 24 bits, we don't know how that image is going to be altered or truncated. So one thing, and it will be a theme throughout every encounter you have with the world of digital preservation, is that digital preservation recommendations always lag behind the state of the art because we're trying to control for unknowns. So a classic example of this is in the WAV file format that's used for audio data. Some programs are better than others at respecting the length of a WAV file. And so there was a problem early on in audio digitization where if you put any metadata into the header of the file, so say you add the title of the track to the audio file, it would then trim off that many bits from the tail end of the file. There were pieces of software that were not smart enough to know the file had gotten bigger with the addition of metadata, so you would end up clipping the back end of the file. The same thing can happen when a 32-bit image hits a 24-bit pipe in the workflow somewhere. So if you can ensure and make sure that your entire imaging chain is 32-bit all the way through, you in fact can get a much richer image. 24-bit is just a much safer recommendation. Let's see, we talked about... so there's a note here on supplementary materials, so sort of for ebooks and published versions. I would encourage you to beware of kind of mixing and matching two problems. So one is this question of kind of what's preservable, right? So all of those recommendations for supplementary materials, intellectual control, really have to do with essentially metadata structures, right? How do you make sure that part A relates to part B and that parts A and B are seen as part of the larger whole X? Each one of those parts will still have to be represented as text and graphic data. And so there are sort of two levels here, where on the one hand, you want to make sure that all of the information you're collecting is in good text formats. UTF-8 is where we would like to see everyone coalesce right now. And that also any image data that's coming in is in viable formats. There's then a second question of sort of how you arrange all of that material into a coherent digital object. And this has become a problem in, for instance, electronic journal publication, where a journal article may have text, some associated charts, it may have a data set that goes along with it, and keeping all of those things together as an intellectual entity is a sort of complex description or arrangement problem. The individual charts should be in reliable formats. The individual images should be, and the individual text should be as well. Does that speak to the issue? Am I interpreting the question correctly there? If not, just post something else in the chat, and we can come back to it. So then there's a question here about JPEG 2000 readers. And so this is one of the problems in JPEG 2000, is that not only do you have to have a good reader, but you have to have a good server. So there's plenty of software that knows how to decode a JPEG 2000, but for those features to be useful, the JPEG 2000 has to also be delivered. So unlike the sort of standard model where you request a file, it's delivered to you, and the transaction is done, in the JPEG 2000 world, there is ideally a dialogue between the server and the client. So my software says, show me a version at this resolution, and the server delivers it, and my client then says back, actually give me a little more data, and then the server gives me that extra data. And what's problematic for us is that we don't have every piece in that chain linked together yet. So if you had the right software, you still might not have any content to look at, and people aren't creating content for people to look at because there aren't great readers out there to do it. So there's a sort of chicken-egg problem that we're still overcoming in JPEG 2000. But many, the QuickTime plugin supports JPEG 2000 pretty well now. There are a number of freely available readers, but you still need the right server infrastructure to connect to.